The Whitmore family name carries with it the kind of weight that unsettles even the bravest of souls. Whispers of their legacy have lingered through centuries, seeping into folklore, fueling ghost stories, and staining history with dread. In the rolling countryside of England, far removed from the bustling streets of London, the Whitmore Manor once stood as a towering monument to aristocratic power. Its grand halls, lavish gardens, and imposing stone walls were symbols of wealth and influence, yet beneath the gilded surface lay rot, secrets, and an insatiable hunger for power that stretched far beyond mortal reach. It was in the early 1700s that the Whitmores first began to make their mark. They arrived from obscurity, claiming ancestral ties to nobility, though no one could ever trace their exact origin. Their sudden rise puzzled neighbors and unsettled rivals. Land was bought, titles were secured, and alliances forged with an unnatural speed. Some claimed that Archibald Whitmore, the enigmatic patriarch, had discovered hidden fortunes overseas. Others whispered of darker dealings. Forbidden rights in foreign lands, secret pacts sealed with blood, and promises made not to men, but to forces far older, far more sinister. The manor itself became the centerpiece of their legacy. Built atop an ancient foundation, its walls seemed to hum with something otherworldly. Servants spoke of strange sounds in the dead of night, of footsteps echoing where no one walked, of shadows that clung longer than they should. Rumors of locked rooms and hidden chambers grew with every generation, though none who worked for the family dared to speak openly. To challenge the Whitmores was to invite ruin, for their reach extended into courts, trade, and even the church itself. But where there is power, there is also suspicion. Local villagers avoided the estate, muttering prayers whenever they passed by its iron gates. Priests warned parishioners to steer clear of Whitmore dealings, though even they hesitated to speak too loudly. It was said that those who crossed the family often met sudden, inexplicable ends. Crops would fail, livestock would vanish, and in some cases, entire households would be struck by mysterious illness. To the people, the Whitmores were not just aristocrats. They were a curse. Over time, the family's reputation twisted into something far darker than mere superstition. Children disappeared from nearby villages, their fates never known. Travelers spoke of ghostly figures watching from the manor's high windows. And at the center of it all was the Whitmore bloodline, whose members seemed both gifted and cursed. Some were brilliant scholars and politicians, rising to prominence with startling ease, while others descended into madness, plagued by visions and violent obsessions. Each generation seemed to bear the weight of something unnatural, something inherited that could not be escaped. Yet despite all the horror, the Whitmores endured. They adapted, evolved, and tightened their grip on power, even as their name became synonymous with fear. Their wealth shielded them from justice, their influence silenced questions, and their secrets remained buried within the manor's labyrinthine halls. For every rumor, there was a denial; for every disappearance, a convenient explanation. Still, the whispers never stopped. The tale of the Whitmore family is not merely one of wealth or nobility. It is the story of a dynasty built on shadow and blood, of ambition unchecked by morality, and of a curse that seemed to seep deeper into the soil with every passing year. To speak of them is to peel back the layers of history and confront the chilling truth that some legacies are not celebrated. They are endured, feared, and whispered only in the darkest hours. This is their story. The macabre history of the Whitmore family. The dawn broke over the English countryside with a pale, gray light casting long shadows across the mist that clung to the fields. On the horizon, Whitmore Manor loomed like a sentinel, its towers stabbing into the sky, its windows dark and watchful, as though they held secrets no sunbeam could pierce. It was here, in this imposing fortress of stone and silence, that the story of the Whitmores truly began. Archibald Whitmore, the patriarch of the family, stood at the center of it all, a man whose name would echo through history with both reverence and dread. Archibald was not a man of ordinary ambition. He possessed a calculating mind, sharp enough to outwit rivals and cold enough to bend morality until it suited his needs. When he first arrived in England, he was little more than a stranger with a foreign accent and a fortune whose origins no one could trace. Yet within a decade, he had carved out a place among the aristocracy. He purchased land, secured alliances through marriage, and commissioned the building of Whitmore Manor on foundations older than anyone could remember. The stones were quarried from ground long rumored to be cursed. once the site of pagan rituals that had stained the soil with blood. Those who worked on the manor told stories of strange occurrences during its construction. Tools vanished without explanation, scaffolds collapsed though no wind stirred, and workers fell ill with fevers that had no cure. Some swore they heard chanting in the night, low and guttural voices carried on the wind, though no one stood near. When one young mason was found lifeless at the base of a tower with no mark upon his body, whispers began to spread that Archibald had stirred something ancient in his quest for grandeur. Yet the work continued, driven by his will and the wealth he dispensed freely to silence fear. Inside the manor, Archibald's presence was inescapable. He ruled his household with the same iron grip with which he dealt with rivals beyond the estate's gates. His wife, Lady Margaret, was a figure of grace and quiet suffering, known more for her silences than her words. Their children, 3 sons and a daughter, grew beneath the shadow of their father's ambition, each molded by his expectations. The eldest son, Henry, inherited his father's ruthless nature, though he lacked the patience to temper it. The second, Thomas, was a frail child plagued by visions and nightmares that left him trembling in the night. The youngest, Edward, was spirited and reckless, forever chasing mischief. Their sister, Isabella, bore a beauty so striking it seemed almost unearthly, though her gaze was said to hold an unsettling intensity, as though she could see through the souls of those who looked too long. Archibald was known to host gatherings at the manor that stirred both awe and suspicion. Noblemen and merchants came from afar to feast in his grand halls, where wine flowed and laughter echoed. Yet servants whispered of what followed after the guests departed the locked doors. The strange lights flickering in the upper rooms, the low hum of voices chanting in unrecognizable tongues. There were tales of Archibald retreating to a hidden chamber beneath the manor, carrying with him old tomes bound in leather and marked with symbols no priest would dare to bless. It was said that he sought knowledge forbidden by God, that he craved more than wealth. He craved power that could outlast death itself. The villagers who lived in the shadow of Whitmore Manor grew wary. Their livestock grew sick without cause. Their children woke screaming from nightmares of black figures standing at their bedsides, and the air around the manor seemed heavier, as if the very land was suffused with dread. Some claimed that the church bells would falter when rung near the estate, their tones breaking into hollow echoes as though swallowed by unseen forces. Still, few dared to confront Archibald, for those who spoke too loudly against him often met grim fates. A farmer who accused the Whitmores of witchcraft was found drowned in the river, though his body bore no signs of struggle. Another villager who refused to pay his debts to Archibald vanished, leaving behind only a blood-stained cap. The Whitmore children grew within this atmosphere of wealth and unease. Henry followed his father into politics, learning to manipulate allies and crush opposition with practiced cruelty. Thomas, sickly and haunted, began to draw strange symbols on the walls of his chamber, claiming they protected him from the dark figures that visited his dreams. Edward, restless and defiant, often clashed with his father, sneaking into the village taverns and whispering that one day he would leave Whitmore Manor behind forever. Isabella, ever silent, wandered the halls at night, her candle casting long shadows that seemed to move differently than her steps. Servants swore that they saw her speaking to empty corridors, her lips moving in soft whispers that echoed faintly in the stillness. Archibald himself only grew more enigmatic with age. His hair silvered, but his eyes burned with the same intensity, and his presence seemed to command silence wherever he went. He rarely attended church, preferring instead to seclude himself in his study, where he pored over books written in languages few recognized. Visitors noted the strange objects adorning his shelves: bones carved with runes, jars containing substances that glowed faintly in the dark, and relics said to be older than the manor itself. When pressed about these curiosities, Archibald would smile thinly and change the subject, his silence more unsettling than any admission. As the years passed, the stories surrounding the Whitmores grew darker. A maid was discovered lifeless in her chamber, her body untouched yet her face twisted in terror. A guest at one of Archibald's feasts fell ill and perished within days, his skin mottled as though burned by unseen fire. At night, villagers swore they heard cries carried on the wind, emanating from the manor's highest tower. And always, at the center of it all, was Archibald Whitmore, a man who seemed untouched by time, whose fortune never waned, and whose gaze seemed to pierce through those who dared to meet it. By the end of the century, the Whitmores were no longer merely aristocrats. They were legends, their names spoken in hushed tones, their manner a looming reminder that wealth and power often come at terrible cost. The villagers avoided the estate more than ever, crossing themselves as they passed, whispering prayers to keep the darkness at bay. But within the walls of Whitmore Manor, the family thrived, bound together not just by blood, but by something deeper, something more sinister, something that no mortal hand could break. The foundations had been laid. The pact, whatever it was, had been sealed, and the Whitmores would carry its weight for generations to come. The winter of 1712 fell harder than any the villagers had known in decades. Frost clung to the fields like a death shroud, the earth frozen so solid it refused to yield to plow or spade. Crops withered, livestock starved, and a hunger gnawed at the countryside that seemed less natural famine and more curse. Yet while the peasants suffered, Whitmore Manor gleamed with abundance. Smoke billowed from its chimneys, its storerooms overflowed with salted meats and grains, and its halls rang with the sound of music and feasting. To the villagers, this was proof enough that the Whitmores had bartered with forces beyond their comprehension. Archibald Whitmore walked the frost-covered gardens of his estate with the confidence of a man untouched by the misery of those around him. His breath smoked in the air. Though he wore no cloak, it was said that cold no longer bit him, that his body was fortified by whatever bargain he had struck years earlier. Servants watched him from afar, whispering of how his shadow sometimes seemed longer than it should be, stretching unnaturally across the frozen earth. It was during this cruel winter that the first true rumors of a pact began to take shape. A traveling monk, Father Oswin, arrived in the village, declaring that famine was no accident but the result of wickedness festering in Whitmore Manor. He spoke of Archibald's journeys to far-off lands, of his dealings with occultists and mystics, and of the whispers that he had brought something back with him, something that fed on suffering. The villagers, desperate and starving, listened eagerly, their fear turning slowly into anger. Yet none dared act. For every curse they muttered under their breath, they knew someone who had challenged the Whitmores and never returned. Inside the manor, life was a stark contrast. Archibald's eldest son, Henry, thrived under his father's tutelage. He had inherited not only Archibald's sharp wit, but his unflinching cruelty. Where Archibald maneuvered with patience, Henry struck swiftly, crushing opposition without hesitation. He began to manage the family's dealings, negotiating with merchants and lords alike, his youth hidden behind the confidence of one born to power. Yet there was a hunger in his eyes, a recklessness that unsettled even his father. Thomas, the sickly second son, withered further as the cold deepened. His visions became more violent, his nights filled with screams that rattled the manor's walls. He scrawled strange symbols across his bedsheets, muttering of black figures with hollow eyes who watched him even in daylight. Lady Margaret, his mother, tried to soothe him, her own face gaunt from sleepless nights, but even her gentle touch could not pull him back from whatever shadows claimed him. Servants claimed to hear Thomas speaking in voices not his own, deep guttural tones that reverberated unnaturally through the halls. Edward, the youngest son, grew more rebellious with each passing day. He despised the chill of the manor and the constant whispers of dread that clung to its corridors. Unlike his brothers, he felt no pride in the Whitmore name. He often slipped away into the village, where he drank with farmers and listened to their fears. Though he enjoyed their company, he also carried their warnings back to the manor, sometimes mocking his father with tales of how the villagers believed the Whitmores to be cursed. Archibald never punished Edward for these insolent remarks, but his silence was perhaps more terrifying than anger. Isabella, the daughter, had grown into a figure of haunting beauty. Though barely 16, she carried herself with a composure that unsettled even grown men. Her presence seemed to still rooms, her eyes were dark pools in which secrets seemed to swim. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried weight, as though she knew far more than her years allowed. Servants swore that she could calm Thomas's fits merely by entering his chamber, though they also whispered that she sometimes emerged pale and trembling, as if she had absorbed his nightmares herself. As the famine worsened, Father Oswin became bolder. He preached in the village square that Archibald had sold his soul and bound the land to ruin. He demanded that the villagers confront the family, to demand penance or risk eternal damnation themselves. Word reached Archibald swiftly. That night, the monk vanished. Some said he was last seen walking toward the manor gates, his torch flickering in the frost-bitten wind. Others claimed they heard his screams carried on the night air, cut short by a silence so heavy it pressed on their hearts. By morning, only his rosary was found. Lying at the edge of the estate, the beads cracked as though crushed by an unseen hand. After Oswin's disappearance, fear tightened its grip on the village. No one dared speak against the Whitmores again. Mothers drew their children closer, fathers turned their faces away when passing the gates, and all prayed that their family would not be the next to vanish. Yet even silence could not shield them. Cows were found mutilated in their barns, crops blackened overnight, and children woke screaming of a woman in black standing at the foot of their beds. Always, the rumors circled back to the manor. Within the manor's locked chambers, Archibald's practices grew bolder. Servants reported hearing chanting echoing through the floors late at night, though none dared investigate. One maid, curious and foolish, crept to the door of Archibald's study one evening. She claimed to have seen him kneeling before a book that glowed faintly in the candlelight, its pages turning of their own accord. She swore he was speaking not to himself but to something unseen, a presence that replied in whispers too faint to understand. Terrified, she fled the estate the next morning, but her story lingered long after her departure. The famine eventually broke, but the scars remained. Villagers buried their dead, rebuilt their farms, and whispered prayers over their fields. Yet none forgot the winter when the Whitmores thrived while others starved. The family's power had grown, their wealth untouched, their influence deeper than ever. To the villagers, it seemed that Archibald had triumphed not only over nature but over God himself. But beneath his triumph lay the beginnings of rot. Henry's ambition drove him into conflicts with neighboring lords, sowing seeds of dangerous enmity. Thomas's health waned further, his mind slipping into madness that no priest or physician could cure. Edward's defiance grew sharper, his threats to abandon the family more frequent, and Isabella, with her unsettling calm and knowing gaze, became a figure of fascination and fear even within the manor walls. Archibald had secured his family's power, but at a cost none of them yet understood. The whispers of the pact grew louder with each passing year, and the shadows that clung to Whitmore Manor seemed thicker, darker, more alive. The family was bound together not just by blood, but by something deeper, something ancient, something that would ensure their name endured long after others had crumbled into dust. The Whitmores had entered into their inheritance, and already the curse had begun to spread. The years that followed the bitter winter were marked not by peace, but by an unsettling quiet, the kind of silence that feels less like calm and more like a predator waiting in the dark. Whitmore Manor stood as it always had, its stone walls unyielding, its chimneys smoking, its halls echoing with the voices of a family both blessed and damned. But within those halls, shadows stretched longer, secrets grew heavier, and the whispers of the villagers beyond the gates carried a sharper edge of fear. Archibald Whitmore had grown older, though his vitality seemed unbroken by age. His hair had turned silver, yet his eyes remained sharp and alive, glittering with a kind of unnatural fire. He spent long nights locked in his study, poring over manuscripts and scrolls written in strange languages. Servants sometimes swore they heard a second voice in the room, low and guttural, speaking words that made their blood turn cold. No one dared to question him, for his authority remained absolute, but unease hung over the estate like a storm cloud. Henry, the eldest son, now a man in his 20s, stepped more boldly into the world of politics and trade. He had inherited his father's ruthless nature, but carried none of Archibald's patience. He was quick to anger, quicker still to act, and more than one rival had fallen under mysterious circumstances after crossing his path. Rumors followed him wherever he went, stories of business partners ruined overnight, of duels fought under questionable circumstances, of sudden deaths that seemed less accident and more design. He relished the power, basked in the fear he commanded, and returned to the manor each night to boast of his triumphs. Thomas, meanwhile, grew weaker by the year. His health was fragile, his body thin and frail, but it was his mind that suffered most. The visions that plagued him as a child had only intensified, filling his nights with screams that rattled the walls of his chamber. He drew strange sigils across the floor in chalk, claiming they kept the shadows at bay, Those servants often found them smudged by unseen hands come morning. Sometimes he would lapse into trances, whispering in voices that were not his own, speaking names that none recognized. Lady Margaret devoted herself to his care, though her once radiant beauty withered under the strain. Her eyes were sunken, her smile rare, and her whispers of prayer seemed powerless against the darkness consuming her son. Edward remained the family's wild card. Restless, rebellious, and unafraid to mock the heirs of nobility, he spent more time among the villagers than within the manor. He drank with them, listened to their tales, and earned their cautious trust, though even they eyed him with suspicion. He was still a Whitmore, after all, and no amount of laughter or charm could erase that curse. He clashed constantly with Henry, their fights often ending in broken furniture and bloodied lips. Archibald tolerated Edward's disobedience, though his silence in the face of such rebellion was itself unnerving, as though he knew something about his youngest son's fate that no one else did. And then there was Isabella. By 18 she had blossomed into a woman of haunting beauty, her presence both captivating and unsettling. Suitors came from miles around, drawn by whispers of her striking looks, yet few returned with enthusiasm. They described her gaze as unbearable, her words as chilling, her presence as suffocating. One man swore he saw her reflection in a mirror move, when she herself stood still, while another claimed she laughed at something he could not see, her voice lilting and cold. To her family she was both comfort and curse. Thomas seemed calmed by her touch, Edward adored her, and Henry grew possessive in a way that bordered on obsession. Archibald, for all his composure, regarded her with something that looked more like fear than paternal affection. It was around this time that the manor itself began to reveal its darker nature. Servants spoke of doors that locked themselves, of windows that rattled without wind, of whispers echoing through the halls at night. One maid claimed she saw a figure standing at the end of a corridor, tall, cloaked, its face hidden. Yet when she approached, it vanished into shadow. Another swore that the mirrors in the east wing reflected not the present, but moments of the past. Fleeting images of people long dead walking the halls as if still alive. The more the servants whispered, the more those whispers spread into the village, feeding the growing legend of Whitmore Manor as a place not merely cursed but alive with something unnatural. The villagers avoided the estate more than ever, crossing themselves as they passed and warning their children never to stray near its gates. Yet curiosity has a way of drawing the foolish, and one night a group of young men dared each other to trespass on the manor grounds. They returned pale and trembling, claiming they had heard cries from the highest tower, screams of a woman that echoed across the frozen fields. One swore he saw a figure in white standing at the window, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. None of them ever dared return, and 2 left the village altogether within weeks, as though fleeing something they could not name. Archibald ignored the rumors or perhaps fed on them. His gatherings at the manor became more secretive, his study more heavily guarded. Guests arrived cloaked in secrecy, slipping into the estate under the cover of night. Their carriages bore no crests, their faces remained hidden, and their visits often lasted until dawn. What transpired behind locked doors remained unknown, though servants reported strange chanting, the smell of burning herbs, and the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Once, a footman claimed he glimpsed a symbol carved into the skin of one guest's arm, glowing faintly in the candlelight before the man pulled his sleeve down to hide it. Lady Margaret grew weaker as the years passed. The strain of Thomas's illness, Edward's rebellion, and Henry's cruelty weighed heavily upon her. She retreated into the chapel on the manor grounds, spending hours in prayer. Though even there she claimed she could not find peace. She confided to her chambermaid that the walls themselves seemed to watch her, that the crucifix above the altar had once fallen without cause, striking the stone floor with a sound that reverberated like thunder. Her prayers became more frantic, her whispers more desperate, until even the servants began to fear she had lost her faith, or that something had taken it from her. By the turn of the decade, the Whitmores stood at the height of their power, yet within their own walls they were already unraveling. Henry's ambition threatened to draw dangerous enemies. Thomas hovered on the edge of madness, Edward flirted with betrayal, and Isabella's presence unsettled even those who loved her. Archibald alone seemed untouched, though the fire in his eyes grew brighter, hungrier, as though he had glimpsed something beyond the grasp of ordinary men. The villagers waited, watching from the shadows, their fear mingled with a growing hatred. They whispered of curses and sacrifices, of blood spilled in secret and shadows that walked the halls of the manor. Some prayed for deliverance, others plotted in silence, but all knew one truthy. The Whitmore family was not like other families. Their wealth, their beauty, their power. It was all bound by something darker, something unnatural, something that would not be denied. And as the years stretched on, the first cracks in the grand facade of Whitmore Manor began to show, cracks that would widen into chasms and swallow all who bore the cursed name. The winter of 1821 settled heavy upon Whitmore Manor, pressing its weight into the stone as if to suffocate what lay within. Snow draped the sprawling grounds in silence, yet within the walls of the estate, that silence was broken by the restless murmur of the household, a murmur that seemed to carry unease rather than comfort. It was during this season that the manor revealed its first true secret, not whispered by servants or suspected by villagers, but unearthed by accident. Like a wound festering beneath the skin that finally split open, it began with Thomas. His illness had worsened to the point that he rarely left his chamber. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words no one understood, clawing at his bed linens as though something unseen perched at the foot of his bed. His drawings, once chalk scrawls upon the floor, now stretched across the walls, grotesque sketches of twisted figures and hollow-eyed faces that no living man could claim to have seen. Lady Margaret, gaunt and sleepless, forbade servants from cleaning them away, insisting that to erase them was to invite greater torment. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees, Isabella slipped into Thomas's room. She had a way of calming him when no one else could, her touch cool against his fevered skin. Yet as she soothed him that night, Thomas suddenly clutched her wrist with a strength that belied his frailty. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened, and in a guttural voice not his own he whispered, "Below the chapel. Do not open the door." The words chilled Isabella to her core. She told no one, but the warning festered in her mind. Days later, while wandering the manor grounds, she found herself drawn to the old chapel. It stood apart from the main house, a crumbling structure half swallowed by ivy, its stained glass fractured by time. The crucifix above the altar hung askew, the stone floor cold beneath her feet. She knelt, her hands brushing against the cracks in the flagstones, when she felt a draft of air rising from below. Her fingers traced the edge of one stone, loose where the others held firm. Beneath it, hidden beneath centuries of dust, was a stairwell leading down into the earth. Isabella hesitated only a moment before descending. The air grew colder as she went, heavy with the stench of damp, and something fouler still. The stair ended in a chamber lit faintly by the shaft of light from above. Symbols carved into the walls glowed faintly in the dark, their shapes cruel and jagged. At the center of the room was an altar, not one of faith but of sacrifice, its surface stained black with what could only have been blood. Rusted chains dangled from the walls, and the floor bore grooves where something heavy had been dragged again and again. A sound stirred behind her. She turned and saw her father. Archibald Whitmore stood at the base of the stairs, his silver hair gleaming in the dim light, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, only regarded her with eyes that burned as brightly as the symbols on the walls. Then, in a voice soft yet commanding, he spoke, "You should not be here, Isabella." She did not speak, her lips trembling, her gaze locked on the altar. Archibald stepped forward, his hand firm upon her shoulder, guiding her back toward the stairs. "What you see here," he whispered, "is not for you to question. It is for you to understand in time. This family is bound to powers greater than kings, greater than priests. One day you will see why." He led her away, sealing the stone once more above the stairwell. From that day forward, Isabella could not forget what she had seen. At night she dreamed of the altar, of voices chanting in the dark, of figures cloaked in shadow bowing before something vast and unseen. She awoke with her heart racing, her skin damp with sweat, her brother Thomas's voice echoing in her ears, "Do not open the door." Yet the door was open, and the secret was no longer hidden. The servants began to notice changes. The air within the chapel grew colder, so cold that candles sputtered and died when brought inside. Strange noises echoed from its walls, low moans, the rattle of chains, the scrape of stone. Some swore they saw figures moving in the shadows where none should have been, their forms flickering in and out like smoke. One maid collapsed after claiming she saw Lady Margaret kneeling at the altar below, her hands drenched in blood, though Margaret herself had been in her chambers at the time. The villagers, too, sensed something. They spoke of lights glowing in the chapel at night, of figures entering through the side door only to vanish within. They whispered that the Whitmores were no longer merely cursed. They were chosen by something darker, something that demanded more than prayers or offerings. Some called for the chapel to be burned to the ground, but fear held their hands back. None dared cross the Whitmores openly, not when so many who had opposed them had vanished or met ruin. Edward, ever restless, discovered the truth in his own way. Returning late one night from the village, half drunk and reckless, he stumbled upon his father and Henry emerging from the chapel. Both carried lanterns, their faces grim, their clothes marked with stains Edward did not wish to name. They froze when they saw him, the air between them taut with unspoken words. Archibald finally broke the silence. "Go to your bed, Edward. You have seen nothing." But Edward had seen, and he would not forget. Unlike Isabella, who kept her silence, Edward whispered the truth to the villagers, weaving it into drunken boasts and careless laughter. The more he spoke, the less they dismissed him, until fear began to stir into something sharper. Henry, meanwhile, embraced the secret as though it were his birthright. He joined his father in the hidden chamber, his ambition fed by the rituals performed there. He emerged from each gathering with eyes alight, his voice brimming with confidence, his cruelty sharper than ever. He began to speak openly of destiny, of a power that would carry the Whitmores beyond mere wealth and title into something eternal. Lady Margaret, once a figure of piety, grew gaunter still. She prayed not in the chapel but in her own chamber, whispering to a god she feared no longer listened. Some nights she wandered the halls, clutching a rosary so tightly that her fingers bled, her eyes hollow, her voice hoarse with desperate pleas. She knew what lay beneath the chapel. She knew, and it was breaking her. As for Thomas, his visions turned darker still. He spoke of fire and shadow, of faces without eyes, of screams that echoed through the earth. He clawed at his skin, as if trying to tear something out from within. One night, he painted the walls of his chamber with his own blood, the same sigil Isabella had seen carved into the walls below. When confronted, he only laughed, his voice hollow and broken. The Whitmore family was unraveling, each bound by the secret beneath their chapel, each consumed by it in different ways. The altar had been revealed, the truth exposed, and with it came a certainty none could deny. The darkness within Whitmore Manor was no longer hidden in shadow. It had awakened, and it demanded more. The year 1823 came upon the village with a cruel spring, the kind that promised rebirth but delivered only decay. While the fields should have blossomed, a strange blight took hold. Crops withered before they could ripen, animals were born sickly, and an unnatural mist clung to the earth each dawn, thick enough to choke the breath. The villagers, already wary of the Whitmores, now began to whisper with certainty that the family was the root of their suffering. All misfortune, they said, flowed down from Whitmore Manor like poison in a well. Inside the manor, life had grown stranger still. The chapel below the ground had become a place of gathering, and though Archibald Whitmore insisted these were matters of heritage and tradition, the truth was darker. Once a fortnight, under the veil of midnight, lanterns were lit along the hidden stair, and cloaked figures, friends of the Whitmores, though none from the village, descended into the chamber. Isabella heard them sometimes, the low hum of chants rising up through the cracks in the stone, the sound vibrating the crucifix above until it trembled on its rusted nails. The air in her chamber turned heavy during these nights, pressing against her skin until sleep became impossible. She would sit awake, staring at the darkness, certain that someone, or something, stared back. Henry had taken to leading some of these rites alongside his father. His ambition had ripened into something dangerous, a hunger not for coin or land but for permanence, for dominion over more than men. When he returned from these midnight gatherings, he carried an energy that unsettled even the servants. His eyes glittered like the altar stone, his voice carried a weight that made the strongest footmen bow their heads without knowing why. He began to speak of destiny not in whispers but at the dining table, declaring that the Whitmores were chosen to endure long after others had turned to dust. Edward, reckless and restless, could no longer remain silent. The night he caught sight of his father and Henry dragging what looked like a sack through the chapel door. its shape and weight far too human to dismiss. His outrage burned too hot to contain. In the village tavern, he poured out his suspicions, his words blurred with drink but sharp enough to cut. He told of the hidden stair, of the blood-stained altar, of the cloaked men who crept into the manor like thieves. At first, the villagers dismissed his ranting, chalking it up to a son's rebellion against his father. But when livestock continued to die, when a child fell ill with a sickness no physician could name, Edward's words began to sound less like drunken nonsense and more like prophecy. By summer, fear had become fury. The villagers no longer passed the manor silently. Now they spat toward its gates, hurled stones at its walls, muttered curses that no prayer could counter. The Whitmores heard them. From her window, Isabella watched as groups gathered on the lane at dusk, torches in hand though they never lit them, staring at the house as if daring it to breathe. Their eyes followed her when she walked in the gardens. Their mutters grew into shouts when Henry rode through the village, and their courage hardened each time Edward slipped among them with whispers of what he had seen. Within the manor walls, tension swelled. Lady Margaret, once the heart of the household, had become a husk of her former self. She moved like a ghost, rosary clenched in bleeding hands. Her prayers no longer whispered but wailed, echoing through the corridors until servants fled from her path. Sometimes she begged Archibald to stop, to close the chamber and burn the altar. But Archibald, his face carved of stone, would only reply that she did not understand, that none of them did. "We are bound," he told her one night, his voice as cold as the frost that clung even in summer. "The Whitmores have always been bound." Thomas, caught between vision and madness, seemed to understand more than anyone. His body grew weaker still, but his words carried a clarity that unsettled those who heard them. He spoke of fire beneath the ground, of wings that spread wider than the sky, of chains that were not meant to hold forever. At night, his screams rattled the windows, and the sigils he scrawled upon his walls seemed to pulse in the candlelight. More than once, servants quit their posts rather than tend to him, claiming his eyes glowed in the dark, or that he spoke to someone unseen at the foot of his bed. The villagers' anger finally came to a head in the autumn. A girl had gone missing, the daughter of a miller who lived near the edge of the woods. Her shawl was found at the boundary of the Whitmore lands, snagged upon a thorn bush. Though there was no proof, suspicion turned to certainty, and certainty became rage. A mob gathered at dusk, armed with scythes and axes, their faces grim with fear and fury alike. They marched to the manor gates, shouting curses, demanding answers. Torches were lit this time, their flames painting the night in violent orange. Inside, Henry urged his father to let him face them, to prove the strength of the family and silence the villagers once and for all. Archibald forbade it, though his command was delivered with calm rather than fear. He ordered the gates barred, the windows shuttered, the family kept within. "They will not cross," he said. "They know the cost." And indeed, the villagers, though they shouted and hurled stones, did not breach the walls. Fear still bound their courage. Yet the air was different now, heavy with the promise of blood. Isabella, watching from her chamber, felt her own heart twist with dread. She knew the villagers were right to fear. Yet she also knew that what they suspected was only the surface of something far deeper, far darker. She remembered the altar, the glowing sigils, the weight of her father's hand upon her shoulder as he whispered of power. And she remembered Thomas's warning, "Do not open the door." But the door was open, and it was not only the Whitmores who would pay the price. That winter, the manor grew more isolated than ever. Servants left in droves, their places filled by strangers brought in from distant towns, men and women who asked no questions but obeyed every command. The villagers no longer dared the gates, but their hatred grew with their silence, festering into something that would not remain contained forever. And in the chapel below, the rituals grew bolder, the chanting louder, the blood fresher. Henry thrived, Archibald endured, Thomas withered, Edward rebelled, Margaret prayed, and Isabella dreamed. Each in their own way. They were bound to the darkness that slept beneath their feet. The Whitmores had become more than a family. They were the heart of a curse that spread beyond their walls, poisoning all it touched. And the land itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of it, as though it, too, longed to be free. But freedom, as Isabella was beginning to understand, would not come without ruin. The weeks after the failed assault on Whitmore Manor were thick with tension. as though the air itself had curdled into something poisonous. Snow still blanketed the fields, but now it was stained with the memory of blood. Villagers carried their wounded in silence, burying their dead in shallow graves that the frozen ground barely allowed them to dig. Yet the spark of defiance had not been extinguished. Instead, it smoldered, hidden beneath grief and hunger, waiting for the right gust of wind to become flame once more. Edward became that wind. He no longer returned to the manor at night. Instead, he slipped between cottages, gathering the people in secret, whispering to them the truths he alone dared speak. He told them of the altar, of the symbols etched in blood, of the rituals that bound the Whitmores to powers beyond mortal understanding. At first, the villagers listened with wide eyes, half disbelieving, half afraid. But when Edward swore upon his own blood that he had seen his father and brother kneeling before that cursed altar, their fear hardened into conviction. A plan was born, not one of reckless rage, but of careful calculation. No longer would they hurl themselves against the walls of Whitmore Manor, where Henry's sword and Archibald's power reigned. Instead, they would strike at the heart of the curse itself, the chapel. Edward promised to lead them to the hidden stair, to the chamber beneath, to the altar where the family's damnation was fed. If they could destroy it, burn it, shatter it, tear it apart stone by stone, the bond would be broken, and the Whitmores' hold over them would crumble. But Edward knew this was no simple task. He had seen what stirred in those shadows, had felt the air grow heavy with a presence that was not human. To strike at the altar was to strike at something vast and unseen, something that might devour them all. Yet his hatred burned too brightly to turn back. He would rather face the abyss itself than watch his family's curse continue to poison the land. Inside the manor, the air was restless. Isabella felt it in every breath, saw it in every flicker of candlelight. The house groaned at night, the timbers creaking as though the walls themselves were alive. Doors opened on their own, footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Whispers slithered through the dark. Her dreams had grown unbearable. Visions of fire flooding the chapel, of chains snapping, of her family's faces melting into hollow-eyed masks. And always, she heard her brother Thomas's voice, "Do not open the door." Yet the door had been opened, and now there was no closing it. Thomas himself seemed half in this world and half in another. His body wasted away, yet his words carried an authority that silenced even Henry. He spoke of a shadow that waited below, of a hunger that grew with each offering. He warned that the villagers would not stop, that they would come again, and that this time they would not leave until the altar was destroyed. Archibald dismissed these ravings, yet Isabella saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Her father, once unshakable, now lingered longer in the chapel, as though trying to assure himself of the power that still bound them. Henry, however, grew bolder. He prowled the halls with sword in hand, daring the villagers to return. He spoke of expanding the rituals, of demanding more, of showing the people that their fear was justified. To him, their hatred was proof of the Whitmores' destiny. The more they cursed the family's name, the stronger his belief grew that the Whitmores were chosen. Lady Margaret withered in silence. She rarely left Thomas's side, her rosary worn smooth, her lips cracked from endless prayer. Sometimes Isabella heard her mother whisper not to God but to the shadows, begging them for mercy, bargaining in a voice choked with despair. The sight broke Isabella's heart, yet it also chilled her, for if her mother's faith had failed, what hope was left? It was Edward who finally reached her. One night, as the manor lay silent, he slipped into her chamber. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, but his voice was steady. "Isabella," he whispered, "you know the truth as well as I. This family is rotting from the inside. Father, Henry, they're blind to it. Thomas is too far gone. Mother is broken. You and I, we're the only ones left who can end this." Isabella's heart ached at his words. She wanted to believe there was still hope, still a way to save what little light remained in their family. Yet she could not deny what she had seen, what she had dreamed. The altar pulsed in her mind, a wound that bled into everything it touched. "And if destroying it brings ruin?" she asked softly. Edward's eyes glinted with something fierce. "Then ruin is better than this." She did not answer, but she did not refuse him. The villagers gathered their courage in secret, sharpening blades, preparing torches, waiting for Edward's signal. Each night they looked to the chapel, its windows dark, its steeple broken, its shadow stretching across the snow like a claw. They knew that within those walls lay the key to their suffering. They knew, too, that to step inside was to risk more than death. Within the manor, Isabella's visions grew sharper. She saw not only the altar, but what lingered beyond it. A vast shape, winged and eyeless, chained in darkness, its breath shaking the earth. She saw her father kneeling before it, Henry standing beside him, their voices rising in worship. She saw Thomas bound in chains of his own blood, his screams swallowed by the dark. And she saw herself standing at the threshold, torn between stepping forward or turning away. On the eve of spring, the snow began to melt, but the ground beneath was black and foul, as though the earth itself had been poisoned. The villagers read it as a sign. Edward gathered them at the edge of the forest, their faces grim, their weapons ready. Isabella stood with him, her cloak drawn tight, her heart pounding with dread and resolve alike. From the manor, a single light glowed in the chapel window, flickering against the dark. Inside, Archibald prepared for another ritual, Henry at his side, Thomas muttering in fevered delirium, Lady Margaret praying in vain. None of them knew that outside, in the shadows of the trees, a storm was gathering, one that would not break until the altar itself had been tested by fire. The Whitmore family stood at the edge of a precipice, bound together by blood and curse alike. The villagers stood ready to sever those bonds, even if it cost them their lives. And Isabella, caught between them, knew that whichever side triumphed, the world would never again be the same. The night chosen for the assault was moonless, the sky heavy with clouds that seemed to press down upon the earth. A biting wind hissed through the trees as the villagers gathered at the edge of the forest, their torches smoldering, their weapons gleaming faintly in the dark. Edward stood at their head, his face grim, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. Beside him, Isabella clutched her cloak tight, her heart thundering with dread. She knew this night would decide not just the fate of the manor, but the legacy of her bloodline. The group moved in silence toward the chapel. The manor itself loomed nearby, its windows dark, its silhouette like the bones of a giant. But the chapel drew their eyes more than the house. Its stone walls seemed to absorb the night, the broken steeple jagged against the clouds. The door stood shut, though a faint glow flickered from within, pulsing as though with a heartbeat. Inside, Archibald Whitmore knelt before the altar. His lips moved in whispers, ancient syllables rolling like smoke. Henry stood watch nearby, his sword glinting in the candlelight, while Thomas muttered feverishly from his cot, his body racked with tremors. Lady Margaret remained in the corner, her rosary falling from her hands, her gaze fixed on the ceiling as though she saw something no one else could. The villagers reached the chapel doors, their breaths fogging in the cold. Edward raised his hand for silence, then pushed forward, the hinges groaning as the door swung open. Torches flared, illuminating the chamber in a sudden blaze of orange. For a moment, everything was still. Archibald turned, his face pale but calm, as though he had expected them all along. "You dare," he said, his voice soft yet heavy, "to step into this house of power." Edward strode forward, brandishing his blade. "It ends tonight, father. No more sacrifices, no more curses, no more Whitmores lording over this land with shadows at their back." Archibald's eyes darkened. "You are blind, boy. This altar sustains us all. Without it, this land will wither. You will bring not freedom but ruin." Before Edward could answer, Henry lunged, his sword flashing. The clash of steel rang out, sparks flying in the dim chamber. Villagers surged forward, some grappling with Henry, others rushing toward the altar. Archibald raised his arms, chanting louder now, his voice echoing unnaturally, reverberating through the stone walls. And then it began. The altar shuddered as though struck by an earthquake. Cracks spread across its surface, glowing faintly red, as if something beneath was alive and pressing outward. The villagers faltered, their courage wavering as a low growl rumbled from the earth, vibrating up through their bones. Candles snuffed out one by one, though no wind touched them. Shadows thickened, slithering across the floor like liquid. Isabella screamed as one of the shadows rose upright, twisting into a form vaguely human but faceless, its edges flickering like smoke. It reached for a villager, its touch sinking into his flesh as though into water. The man shrieked, collapsing into a withered husk, his torch clattering to the ground. Panic erupted. Some fled toward the door, only to find it slammed shut, as if by an invisible hand. Others swung their weapons wildly, but the shadows only laughed, a sound that hissed in their ears and burrowed into their skulls. Edward fought his way toward the altar, Isabella close behind him. Each step was a battle, the air thickening, pressing against their lungs. The glow from the cracks intensified, a crimson light spilling out, illuminating carvings in the stone that none had noticed before. Symbols etched in blood, spirals and eyes and twisted shapes that seemed to move when looked upon. Archibald's voice rose above the chaos, his body trembling as though channeling some vast force. "Behold the covenant!" he cried. "The pact sealed in Whitmore blood! Come forth, O keeper of chains, and claim what is thine." The ground split open beneath the altar with a deafening crack. From the fissure rose a stench of sulfur and decay, burning the villagers' throats. A vast unseen presence pressed into the chapel, warping the air. The walls groaned, stone dust raining from the ceiling. Isabella staggered, clutching Edward's arm, her mind flooded with images not her own, a winged shape coiled in darkness, its eyeless gaze burning into her soul, its hunger stretching across centuries. Henry roared, cutting down another villager, his face twisted with bloodlust. Yet even he faltered when the fissure widened, and a claw vast and black reached up from the depths, scraping against the altar. Sparks flew as stone shattered. Edward raised his torch, his voice breaking as he shouted, "Now! Burn it! Destroy it before it breaks free!" The villagers rallied, hurling their torches at the altar. Flames licked the stone, catching on the carvings, spreading fast. The crimson light fought against the fire, pulsing brighter, but the blaze consumed it, devouring the symbols, searing the cracks. The claw withdrew with a shriek that split the air, a sound that shattered windows and sent blood streaming from ears. Archibald staggered back, his eyes wide with horror. "No, you fools! You doom us all!" The fire raged higher, engulfing the altar. Shadows writhed, shrieking, their forms unraveling into smoke. The fissure slammed shut with a thunderous crack, the ground trembling as though in pain. For a moment, silence fell. Then the roof groaned, and the entire chapel shuddered. Stones split, beams collapsed, flames spread to the walls. The villagers screamed, scrambling toward the door, which this time burst open, spilling them into the cold night. Edward dragged Isabella through the chaos, shielding her from falling debris. Behind them, the chapel roared as it collapsed inward, a tower of flame and stone crumbling into the earth. Sparks shot into the sky, black smoke billowing, the sound of cracking timbers echoing for miles. But not all had escaped. Henry's body lay crushed beneath a fallen beam, his sword still clenched in his hand. Lady Margaret knelt beside Thomas, shielding him as stones rained down, both swallowed in the blaze. And Archibald, last seen reaching toward the altar even as it crumbled, was gone, consumed by the fire and the shadows he had worshipped. The villagers stood in the snow, their torches guttering, their faces pale with shock. They had destroyed the altar, but at a terrible cost. The chapel was gone, the Whitmores broken. Yet even in their triumph an unease lingered. For in the crackling of the flames and the smoke that curled toward the sky, there seemed to echo a whisper, faint but clear, "This is not the end." And Isabella knew, with a chill that sank into her bones, that the thing they had glimpsed in the fissure, the keeper of chains, was not gone. It was only waiting. The ruins of the chapel smoldered for days. Charred beams jutted from the ash like broken bones, and the air stank of smoke and scorched stone. The villagers kept their distance, crossing themselves as they passed, whispering that the ground still trembled when the wind shifted. At first, they told themselves it was only their fear playing tricks, that the altar's destruction had severed the curse forever. But unease clung to them like frost, a weight they could not shake. Edward stood often at the edge of the ruins, staring into the blackened earth. He should have felt triumph. His father and brother dead, the altar gone, the pact broken. And yet there was no triumph, only emptiness. The faces of those who had died haunted him, villagers crushed beneath beams, Henry's twisted body pinned in flame, his mother and Thomas swallowed by the collapse. He had not saved his family, he had destroyed them. Isabella lingered near him, though her presence was a silent one. Her eyes carried shadows, as though she saw things no one else could. She had not spoken of the visions that plagued her since that night, visions of chains clattering in endless darkness, of a winged figure whispering her name. At times she swore she could still hear her father's voice, calling from the ruins the pact endures. The villagers, though shaken, began to reclaim their lives. Crops were planted again, fields once barren now green with shoots of spring. Children's laughter returned to the lanes. though it was often hushed by their parents' sharp warnings not to wander near the manor. The people avoided the great house, which loomed silent and empty, its windows like blind eyes staring out over the land. Without the Whitmores within, it seemed less a home than a tomb. Yet strange things began to stir. It started with the animals. Livestock grew restless, lowing at shadows, refusing to graze near the edge of the forest. Dogs howled at night, their voices rising in eerie unison, then fell silent as though strangled by an unseen hand. Crows gathered on the manor roof, blackening it with their wings, their cries echoing through the valley. Then came the dreams. At first only a few villagers spoke of them, ashamed of their fears, but soon nearly everyone admitted to the same visions: a vast cavern, chains rattling in the dark, a whispering voice promising freedom for a price. Children woke screaming, their eyes rolling back, their lips mumbling words no one understood. Even the strongest men paled when they spoke of the sound, the deep, rhythmic thud like a heartbeat that grew louder each night. Edward listened and knew the truth. Destroying the altar had not ended the curse. It had unleashed something worse. He returned one night to the manor against Isabella's pleas. The great doors groaned as he pushed them open, dust swirling in the moonlight. The halls smelled of rot, as though the house itself were decaying. Portraits of Whitmore ancestors glared down at him, their painted eyes seeming to follow his steps. In the chapel chamber beneath the house, the twin to the one now in ruins, he found what he had feared. The altar was gone, but in its place was a fissure, a jagged wound in the stone floor. From it rose a faint heat, carrying the scent of ash and iron. He leaned closer and thought he heard breathing. That night, Edward did not sleep. Isabella's visions grew sharper. She saw Thomas wandering the halls of the manor, his chains rattling, his face pale and bloodless. She saw Lady Margaret kneeling in the ashes of the chapel, her hands raw, her lips moving in endless prayer. But worse were the glimpses of her father. Archibald stood in the fissure, his face half burned, his hands raised as though in worship, whispering to the thing that loomed behind him. His voice called her name again and again, not as a father but as a priest calling a disciple. The villagers noticed Isabella's pallor, the way she startled at shadows, the way she sometimes spoke in her sleep with words not her own. Whispers began to spread, that the Whitmore curse still lived in her, that the bloodline was poisoned, that perhaps she too would bring ruin. Mothers pulled their children away from her path. Men crossed themselves when she passed. Only Edward remained steadfast at her side, though even he sometimes woke to find her standing at the window, staring toward the ruins with eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The land itself seemed to rebel. Fields that had sprouted green shoots turned black overnight. Wells grew foul, the water stinking of sulfur. A mist began to roll from the forest each dusk, creeping across the fields until the village was swallowed in white. Within the mist, shapes moved, shadows that whispered, shadows that laughed. The villagers demanded answers. They turned to Edward, who had led them once before, but his voice faltered when he told them what he had seen in the manor, what Isabella had dreamed. Some demanded the manor be torn down stone by stone, others that the Whitmore children be driven out, their bloodline cut off. Edward stood firm. "This is not Isabella's doing," he told them, his voice breaking with anger. "This is what my father unleashed. If there is a way to end it, it lies with us, not in punishing her." But even he could not deny the truth. The keeper of chains still stirred, and the Whitmore family remained bound to it. The altar had fallen, but the pact had not died. It had shifted, waiting for a new vessel, a new heir. And in the shadows its whispering voice grew stronger, weaving itself into Isabella's dreams, calling her not as victim but as chosen. One night, as the mist thickened and the villagers barred their doors, Isabella woke to find herself standing at the edge of the ruins, her bare feet cold on the ash. The earth trembled faintly, the fissure glowing with a dull red light. From within came a voice, soft and coaxing. "Daughter of Whitmore, it is your turn now." She fell to her knees, torn between terror and a strange, irresistible pull. For though she hated it, though she wanted nothing more than to break free, she felt the truth deep in her bones. The Whitmore name was not finished. Its shadow would not fade, and perhaps she was already too far entwined to escape. The mist came heavier than ever that night, swallowing the village in a suffocating blanket of white. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered, but still the whispers slid through the cracks like cold fingers. The villagers gathered in the square, faces pale, voices sharp with fear. Children had woken screaming with words that were not their own, cattle lay dead in their pens, and from the ruins of the chapel came the sound of chains dragging across stone. Enough was enough. The council of elders spoke first, their voices trembling but resolute. The Whitmore blood is the source. As long as it flows, the curse will endure. We must end it. We must end them. Their eyes turned to Edward and Isabella, standing apart from the crowd. Edward stepped forward, his fists clenched. You think killing us will end this. You saw it yourselves. The altar destroyed, the chapel burned, yet the darkness still grows. This thing doesn't live in us. It feeds on fear, on worship. My father gave it strength. My brother bowed to it. Isabella is not its servant. She is its prisoner. But fear is a louder voice than reason. Murmurs rose in the crowd, whispers of knives and fire, of purging the Whitmores once and for all. Isabella felt their eyes burn into her, filled with suspicion, hatred, desperation. She could hardly breathe beneath the weight of it. And then the earth shook. A deep groan echoed from beneath the ruins, as though the land itself were splitting. The villagers screamed, scattering as the ground cracked open near the chapel. From the fissure poured a red light, throbbing like the beat of a heart. The chains clattered louder, shaking the night. And then, rising from the smoke, came the shape they had all feared, vast, winged, faceless, its body woven of shadow and flame. The keeper of chains, its voice rolled across the valley like thunder, though it spoke not with words but with hunger. The villagers fell to their knees, clutching their heads, crying out in pain. Edward dragged Isabella behind him, raising his sword though it shook in his hand. You see, cried one of the elders, pointing a trembling finger. It calls to her! It wants her, indeed. The entity's faceless gaze fixed on Isabella. She felt it pressing into her mind, a weight that crushed her chest, a voice whispering through her bones. Daughter of Whitmore, you are mine. Through you, the pact lives. She staggered, clutching her head. Edward, I can't. I feel it inside me. No, Edward said, gripping her shoulders, forcing her to look into his eyes. You are stronger than it. You are not father. You are not Henry. You are you. The keeper roared, the sound splitting the air, tearing shingles from rooftops, shattering glass. Chains erupted from the fissure, lashing across the ground, seizing villagers, dragging them screaming into the smoke. Edward swung his sword, slicing through one chain, but two more rose in its place. Isabella cried out as one wrapped around her wrist, burning her flesh, pulling her toward the light. She fell to her knees, struggling, the voice pounding in her skull. Submit, become mine, fulfill the bloodline, and for a moment she almost did. But then she saw Thomas in her mind, bound in chains, his eyes hollow. She saw her mother on her knees, praying to shadows. She saw her father bowing before the altar, his face lit by red fire. And she realized what they had all lacked, the will to break free. The Whitmores had always given themselves over. But she would not. With a scream that tore from her very soul, Isabella seized the chain around her wrist with both hands and pulled. Flesh burned, skin tore. But she wrenched it free, blood pouring down her arm. The keeper reeled back, its roar shaking the ground. Edward seized the moment. The fissure, he shouted to the villagers. Stones, fire, everything! Bring it down! For once, fear did not paralyze them. Rage and desperation surged instead. Villagers hurled torches, stones, anything they could lift. Flames spread along the fissure's edges, smoke billowing into the night. Chains lashed wildly, dragging more victims. But the people did not stop. Edward and Isabella reached the fissure together, standing at its edge, the keeper rising before them in all its terrible height. Edward raised his sword, but Isabella placed her hand on his arm. It doesn't want you, she whispered. Her voice was steady now, filled with a strange calm. It wants me. And if I don't end this, it never will, Edward said, shaking his head violently. I won't lose you too. You won't, she said softly. You'll carry me? But this ends tonight. Before he could stop her, Isabella stepped into the fissure. Chains whipped toward her, wrapping her body, pulling her upward into the crimson light. The keeper loomed over her, its vast wings stretching wide. But instead of screaming, she spread her arms and shouted words she did not know until that moment, words older than her blood, words that cracked like fire. The chains snapped, one by one they shattered, exploding into sparks that rained down like stars. The keeper shrieked, its form unraveling, its body collapsing into smoke and flame. The fissure roared, the ground splitting wider, then folding inward with a thunderous crash. The light extinguished, and when the dust cleared, Isabella was gone. The villagers stood in silence, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. The fissure was sealed, the keeper destroyed. At last, it was over. Edward fell to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground. His sister was gone. His family was gone. And yet, when he looked at the sky, he thought he saw a single star burning brighter than the rest, steady and calm. The Whitmore name would live on, not as curse, but as memory. Isabella had given her life to sever the chains. The keeper of chains was no more. And in the silence that followed, for the first time in centuries, the valley breathed free.